The raid did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived as most attacks at sea did in the later years of the Pacific War, sudden, uninvited, and loud enough to erase any difference between a quiet watch and a battle station. Aboard USS West Virginia, the air was already heavy with heat and oil, the ship moving steadily through contested waters, where alarms came often and relief came rarely. When the warning sounded, it was not a moment for preparation or role assignment. It was simply a signal that something hostile was already on its way. By that point in the war, the battleship's crew had learned that titles mattered less than proximity. The ship carried gunners, signalmen, damage control parties, and men trained specifically to fight aircraft. It also carried cooks, bakers, and stewards whose work normally kept the ship functioning in quieter, more predictable ways. But Japanese air attacks had a way of flattening those distinctions. When aircraft broke through the outer screen, anyone near a weapon became part of the defense, whether they had trained for it or not. The cook had been below decks only moments earlier, surrounded by steam and metal, focused on tasks that had nothing to do with altitude or speed. When the alarm came, he followed the same instinct as everyone else, up, forward, toward noise and movement. On the deck, the air was already vibrating with the sound of engines, the sharp bark of anti-aircraft fire climbing into the sky. A .50 caliber machine gun stood manned, its barrel snapping with recoil as tracers stitched upward. Another pair of hands joined the mount, then another. The cook took a position without ceremony, his role defined by where he stood rather than what his papers said. There was no time for instruction. He did what the men around him were doing, tracked movement, felt the shudder of the weapon, adjusted his aim by instinct more than calculation. The sky above was a confusion of sound and motion, aircraft cutting in and out of clouds, smoke drifting across the sun. The ship's guns fired continuously, the rhythm broken only by brief lulls as targets shifted or disappeared. In that chaos, individual actions blurred together, indistinguishable from the larger violence unfolding overhead. At some point, one of the attacking aircraft came in low, pressing its run toward the ship. It was close enough to be seen clearly through the vibration and smoke, its outline sharp against the glare. The cook stayed on the trigger as the gun walked its fire upward. He did not hear anything different when it happened. No cheer, no signal. But the aircraft faltered. Its line wavered, then dropped, trailing smoke as it fell away from the formation and into the sea beyond the ship's wake. The firing continued. There was no pause to confirm what anyone had seen. The attack moved on, as attacks always did, either driven off or spent, leaving behind the echo of gunfire and the slow settling of the ship back into routine. Only afterward, when the smoke thinned and the reports were gathered, did the moment separate itself from the larger noise of the engagement. Word passed quietly through the ship that one of the kills credited during the raid had come from an unlikely place. It traveled further than that. In a war that relied on specialization and strict hierarchy, the story unsettled expectations. A man assigned to feed the crew had, in the space of a few seconds, performed the same act as the gunners whose entire training was built around that weapon. There had been no orders, no deliberate transfer of responsibility. There had only been presence, urgency, and the shared understanding that the ship itself was under threat. There was no formal ceremony, no public decoration that followed. The cook returned to his duties, the galley resuming its rhythms of rationing and routine. Yet the story lingered because it captured something true about naval combat in the Pacific. Modern war at sea did not always allow for clean divisions between combatant and non-combatant. When aircraft appeared overhead, everyone aboard became part of the fight, whether they were trained for it or not. In that sense, the incident mattered less for the aircraft that fell than for what it revealed. Victory in those moments did not belong to a rank or a specialty. It belonged to whoever was close enough, steady enough, and willing to act when the sky suddenly turned hostile. When the account reached George S. Patton, it did not arrive as a curiosity passed along for amusement. It came through the same channels that carried casualty lists, after-action reports, and the steady accumulation of small truths that defined how the war was actually being fought. Patton read it in an environment far removed from the deck of a battleship, likely in a tent or requisitioned building, the air thick with dust or cigarette smoke, maps spread across a table, scarred by constant use. To him, the setting did not matter. The content did. Patton had long believed that war was an unforgiving filter. He distrusted the comfort of rigid job descriptions and peacetime assumptions about who mattered when fighting began. Years of training, reading, and personal experience had convinced him that combat did not reward elegance or specialization alone. It rewarded aggression, awareness, and the willingness to act without hesitation. The story of a cook firing a machine gun into the sky and bringing down an enemy aircraft fit neatly into that worldview, not as an exception, but as confirmation. He did not dwell on the weapon or the circumstances of the air raid. What held his attention was the speed with which identity had dissolved under pressure. One moment the man had been responsible for meals and routine. The next, he had been part of the ship's last line of defense. Patton understood the transformation instinctively. He had seen it in North Africa, where clerks found themselves directing traffic under fire, and in Sicily, where drivers became riflemen when columns were ambushed. Titles, he believed, were conveniences of administration, not laws of nature. In Patton's mind, the incident stripped war down to its essential terms. There was danger. There was opportunity. There was a human being standing close enough to matter. Whether that man wore the insignia of a gunner or the stains of a galley apron was irrelevant once the moment arrived. Combat did not ask permission. It did not wait for specialists to be present. It simply tested whoever happened to be there. This was not a romantic notion for Patton. He was deeply suspicious of what he considered false heroics, and he had little patience for stories told purely to inspire. He viewed the cook's action as neither miraculous nor sentimental. To him, it was the predictable outcome of a system under strain, revealing what remained when formal structure broke down. The man had acted because he was ready to act, because he understood, perhaps only instinctively, that survival depended on immediate contribution. Patton's fixation on readiness of spirit was not abstract. He demanded it relentlessly from his own officers and men. He expected soldiers to think beyond their narrow assignments, to anticipate chaos rather than be surprised by it. In briefings and informal remarks, he returned again and again to the idea that any man could become decisive with no warning at all. A battle might turn on a tank commander, or a radio operator, or a private carrying ammunition. The only constant was the need to be mentally prepared to step forward. The cook's burst of fire, anonymous and uncelebrated, illustrated that belief with a clarity Patton appreciated. It showed how quickly usefulness could emerge from unlikely places, and how dangerous it was to assume that effectiveness belonged only to those formally designated for it. In Patton's view, armies that survived were those that understood this truth, even if they never articulated it aloud. They trained broadly, enforced discipline, and fostered a culture where initiative was expected rather than feared. When Patton set the report aside, he did not mark it for follow-up or request commendations. That was not his concern. What mattered was the lesson it reinforced. War, as he saw it, was not a series of controlled performances, but a succession of violent interruptions. In those interruptions, usefulness became fluid, shifting from one man to another without warning. The cook aboard the battleship had simply been the man standing in the right place, with the right resolve, when the test arrived. For Patton, that was the point. Not that anyone could be a hero, but that anyone could become necessary. And in war, necessity was everything. Patton did not treat the story as a tale to be retold for effect. When it surfaced in conversation, it did so in the plain, forceful manner he preferred, often delivered in the midst of routine discussions with officers who were already tired, already pressed, already thinking about the next movement or supply problem. The setting might be a command post in Sicily, a drafty farmhouse in France, or a canvas tent with rain tapping steadily against the roof. Wherever it was told, the point was never framed as inspiration. It was framed as warning. He spoke of it as evidence of something officers too easily forgot. Once units grew large and responsibilities became compartmentalized, no man in uniform, he reminded them, was ever exempt from the battlefield. Clerks, mechanics, cooks, drivers, none of them carried their assignments into combat intact. The war had no respect for organizational charts. When shells fell or aircraft appeared, every soldier present became a combatant by default, whether trained for it or not. Patton insisted that pretending otherwise was a dangerous illusion. This belief was not theoretical. Patton had watched entire formations unravel when men assumed danger would be handled elsewhere. He had seen rear areas suddenly overrun, convoys ambushed miles from the front, headquarters shelled without warning. In those moments, survival depended not on who had been designated to fight, but on who understood that fighting might be demanded of them at any second. The cook aboard the battleship had not waited for permission to become useful. That, Patton emphasized, was the lesson. In conversations with junior officers, he returned to the idea relentlessly. An officer who allowed his men to think of themselves as support first and soldiers second was, in Patton's view, preparing them for confusion and paralysis. He wanted every man to carry the mindset that combat was always possible, even when it seemed distant. Weapons were not ornaments. Training was not ceremonial. Readiness was not a phase that switched on only at the front. Patton's tone in these moments was rarely gentle. He spoke sharply, sometimes dismissively, as if trying to strip away complacency by force of will. He had little patience for the belief that modern war could be safely divided into clean zones of risk and safety. The enemy, he reminded his officers, did not recognize such divisions. Air power, artillery, and mobile forces ensured that no place was ever entirely secure. Any man who believed otherwise was already behind the pace of the war. The story of the cook mattered to Patton because it exposed a fundamental truth about fear. Danger did not announce itself according to rank or assignment. It arrived suddenly, often in places that felt routine moments earlier. Those who survived were not always the most skilled, but those who accepted, without hesitation, that the danger belonged to them as much as anyone else. Patton believed armies failed when too many men subconsciously believed someone else would handle the crisis. At the height of his command, with multiple armies moving under his direction, Patton knew that he could not personally control every engagement. What he could influence was mindset. He wanted officers who understood that leadership did not end with issuing orders, and soldiers who understood that responsibility did not end with job descriptions. In his view, discipline was meaningless without the expectation of personal action when systems broke down. When he spoke of the incident, he did not embellish it. He did not dwell on the aircraft or the gunfire. He focused on the decision made in seconds by a man who did not consider himself exempt from the fight. That decision, Patton argued, was the difference between resilience and collapse. War punished hesitation far more reliably than it punished inexperience. By the time such conversations ended, there was no applause, no sense of closure. The officers returned to their duties, carrying the message whether they welcomed it or not. Patton had planted it deliberately, the understanding that danger was never abstract, never distant, and never someone else's responsibility. In his mind, armies that internalized this truth stood a chance. Those that did not would eventually learn it the hard way. When belief collided with reality, and reality did not yield. Patton never allowed the incident to soften into legend. In his hands, it was stripped of any comforting edge and reduced to a single, unsettling implication. If a man whose daily duties involved ladles and ration lists could act decisively under fire, then there was no refuge left for trained officers who faltered when pressure arrived. He did not frame the story as inspiration. He framed it as indictment. This approach fit neatly into Patton's broader command style, which was built less on praise than on expectation. He believed that armies failed when standards quietly eroded, when responsibility was diluted by process and habit. To him, complacency was rarely loud. It appeared as hesitation, as waiting for clarification, as the subtle belief that someone else would take the lead. The cook's action, unplanned and uncelebrated, became a silent measure against which officers were judged. Patton did not summon formations to hear the story repeated. He did not attach names or seek publicity. Instead, it surfaced in closed conversations, staff meetings, and blunt exchanges with commanders whose units had moved too slowly or responded too cautiously. The message was always implicit rather than theatrical. If an unassigned man could recognize the moment and act, then professional soldiers forfeited any claim to confusion. In North Africa and later in Europe, Patton faced a war that punished delay with brutal efficiency. Enemy counterattacks unfolded quickly, roads clogged without warning, and command decisions often had to be made with incomplete information. He had seen how quickly uncertainty could spread downward when officers hesitated, how that hesitation multiplied as it moved through the ranks. For Patton, the danger was not fear itself, but the acceptance of passivity as reasonable. The story of the cook allowed him to draw a hard line without raising his voice. It suggested that decisiveness was not a product of perfect conditions or flawless planning, but of mental readiness. Patton believed that officers who waited for ideal clarity were already defeated by the pace of modern war. The battlefield, he insisted, did not reward careful spectatorship. It rewarded those who assumed responsibility before it was formally assigned. Within his commands, this philosophy translated into relentless pressure. Officers were expected to know not only their own roles, but the broader intent of the operation. They were expected to act when communications failed, when orders became outdated, when the situation changed faster than headquarters could respond. Mistakes made through action were often tolerated. Paralysis was not. Patton's use of the incident was deliberately quiet. He did not shame individuals publicly, nor did he turn the story into a moral spectacle. Instead, he allowed it to hover in the background, a standard against which behavior was measured. Officers understood the comparison even when it was not spoken aloud. If a man without formal responsibility could meet the demands of combat instinctively, then professional leaders were expected to do no less. This approach created tension. Patton's expectations were exhausting, and his intolerance for hesitation bred resentment as often as respect. Yet he believed that discomfort was preferable to the false confidence that came from routine. War, in his view, was not a place for men who relied on procedure to substitute for judgment. Procedure was useful only until it failed, and it always failed eventually. The cook's action mattered because it exposed a truth Patton considered fundamental. Responsibility in war was not assigned solely by rank or position. It was claimed in moments of crisis by those willing to accept it. Officers who waited for danger to become officially theirs, he believed, were already surrendering initiative to the enemy. As Patton pressed his forces forward, through dust, mud, and shattered towns, this belief hardened into doctrine. He demanded alertness, not because it made men heroic, but because it made them functional under strain. The incident aboard the battleship served as a reminder that war did not ask who was supposed to act. It tested who would. In Patton's philosophy, there was no room for the comfort of exemption. Every uniform implied obligation. Every moment carried potential consequence. The cook's burst of fire was not remarkable because of who fired it, but because it demonstrated what Patton expected from anyone who wore a weapon at his side: readiness without invitation, action without reassurance, and responsibility accepted before it was formally bestowed. To Patton, the episode reinforced a conviction he had carried long before the war spread across continents: that modern combat was defined less by perfect execution than by rapid recovery from failure. He assumed plans would fracture the moment they met resistance. Radios would go silent, roads would choke with wreckage, units would lose cohesion in dust, smoke, or darkness. In that environment, he believed survival depended on men who could step outside narrow definitions of duty and act without waiting to be told what to do. This belief shaped how he spoke to his commanders and how he expected them to train their units. Patton pushed relentlessly for familiarity beyond assigned roles, not as an academic exercise, but as preparation for inevitability. He wanted tank crews who understood infantry movement, infantry officers who grasped logistics, and staff officers who could function when maps no longer matched the ground. The cook's gunfire illustrated the principle with stark simplicity. When structure dissolved, usefulness did not vanish, it merely shifted to whoever was ready to absorb it. Patton's insistence on cross-training was rooted in observation rather than theory. He had watched early campaigns unravel when rigid specialization met fluid conditions. In France during the First World War, he had learned firsthand how quickly plans disintegrated once men were exposed to fire. In the Second World War, with faster movement and wider fronts, the consequences of delay were magnified. He believed that armies clinging too tightly to fixed roles invited paralysis when those roles became irrelevant. The cook aboard the battleship had not paused to ask whether the weapon fell within his responsibilities. He had responded to the presence of danger and the absence of alternatives. That response was exactly what Patton sought to normalize within his commands. He wanted men conditioned to interpret uncertainty not as a reason to wait, but as a signal to act. Orders, in his view, were guides rather than crutches. This philosophy filtered down through training exercises and command expectations. Patton favored drills that disrupted routine and forced improvisation. Units were pushed to continue operations despite simulated losses, broken communications, or missing leadership. The goal was not elegance, but adaptability. He believed that men who trained only under ideal conditions would freeze when reality failed to cooperate. Mental readiness mattered as much as technical skill. Patton demanded that officers internalize the idea that authority could collapse without notice. A platoon leader might be killed, a company commander cut off, a headquarters overrun. In those moments, he expected the nearest capable man to assume control, regardless of rank. The cook's action was not exceptional because it defied protocol, but because it demonstrated awareness of that unspoken rule. Patton's approach was often misunderstood as reckless aggression. In reality, it was rooted in a sober assessment of chaos. He did not believe control could be maintained at all times. Instead, he sought to distribute initiative so widely that the loss of structure would not halt momentum. Every soldier, he argued, carried a fragment of responsibility for the larger fight, whether acknowledged or not. The incident also reinforced Patton's distrust of permission-seeking behavior. He viewed hesitation born of deference as one of the most dangerous habits in war. Men who waited for explicit authorization to act often waited too long. By the time clarity arrived, the moment had passed. The cook's instinctive decision to fire represented the opposite impulse: action taken in recognition of necessity, not instruction. In Patton's mind, this was not a call for disorder, but for preparedness. Discipline provided the foundation, but initiative filled the gaps discipline could not cover. He wanted soldiers who understood the intent behind their mission well enough to act independently when separated from command. Training, therefore, was not merely about repetition, but about judgment under strain. As his forces moved across Europe, this mindset became part of the atmosphere within his commands. It was felt in the tempo he demanded, the independence he allowed, and the intolerance he showed for excuses rooted in role limitation. Men were expected to think beyond the narrow edges of their assignment, to anticipate collapse and move through it rather than be stopped by it. The cook's burst of gunfire remained a quiet reference point, never elevated to legend, never officially celebrated. It endured because it captured in a single moment the condition Patton believed war imposed on everyone it touched. Structure could vanish without warning. Plans could evaporate in seconds. What remained was the individual, standing amid confusion, deciding whether to act. For Patton, that decision was the true measure of readiness, and it was the quality he wanted ingrained in every unit he led. In Patton's understanding of war, identity was provisional. Rank, assignment, and reputation were conveniences carried from yesterday into a present that might erase them without warning. He believed combat had a ruthless clarity that stripped men down to action alone. When the moment arrived, nothing else endured. Not past performance, not intention, only response. The cook's brief emergence into the fight fit that truth precisely, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary in the way war made such moments unavoidable. Patton had seen too many men cling to what they had been trained to do yesterday, even as conditions rendered that training incomplete or irrelevant. He had watched officers hesitate while waiting for confirmation that never came. Soldiers freeze because the situation no longer matched the manual. In those pauses, war made its judgment swiftly. It did not distinguish between courage and confusion, only between movement and stillness. The cook's action, taken without reflection or ceremony, represented movement in its purest form. What mattered to Patton was not that an aircraft fell, but that a man recognized the moment as his. The cook did not pause to measure his suitability. He did not weigh the likelihood of recognition or consequence. He acted because the threat existed and because he was present. Patton believed this instinct separated armies that survived chaos from those that dissolved within it. War, in his view, was not won by exceptional men alone, but by ordinary men who refused to surrender agency when circumstances changed. This belief shaped how Patton interpreted success and failure. He rejected explanations rooted in surprise or disorder. Confusion, he insisted, was not an anomaly, but the natural state of battle. Those who expected clarity before acting misunderstood the environment they were operating in. The cook's gunfire illustrated a principle Patton returned to often. The battlefield rewarded acceptance of uncertainty, not resistance to it. There was no place in Patton's philosophy for the comfort of yesterday's role. He believed that men who defined themselves too narrowly became liabilities under pressure. A soldier who thought of himself only as a clerk or driver was, in Patton's mind, already retreating from responsibility. War erased such distinctions without apology. The cook did not become something new in that instant. He simply stopped being shielded by routine. Patton's conversations often returned to this point, stripped of rhetoric. He did not celebrate the cook as a hero. He treated him as evidence. Evidence that the war would not wait for preparation to be complete, that it would demand action from whoever stood closest when the moment arrived. In that demand, Patton saw no injustice, only reality. The battlefield did not care who a man had been assigned to be. It cared whether he could respond. This outlook lent Patton's leadership an unforgiving edge. He measured men by what they did under strain, not by intention or explanation. Officers who justified hesitation with reference to protocol found little sympathy. Soldiers who acted decisively, even imperfectly, earned his respect. The cook's moment of action became a quiet standard, not spoken aloud, but understood. If a man with no expectation of combat could act without hesitation, then those trained and entrusted with command had no excuse for inertia. Patton believed that victory emerged from this relentless accountability, not because every man would always choose correctly, but because refusing to act was the one failure war never forgave. He accepted mistakes as the cost of momentum. He did not accept passivity. The cook's action mattered because it demonstrated the simplest possible form of engagement: recognition of danger followed by response. In the end, the cook did not become famous in the way wartime narratives often preferred. There were no speeches, no elevation of the moment beyond its practical consequence. That, too, aligned with Patton's view. War was not a stage for recognition, but a series of tests administered without warning. Survival and success belonged to those who treated every moment as potentially decisive. For Patton, the lesson was stark and unyielding. War did not preserve the past. It did not honor intention or excuse delay. It confronted each man with a single question, asked again and again in different forms. Will you act now, or will you wait? The cook's burst of gunfire answered that question without reflection. In Patton's world, that answer was everything.